In the glittering world of the Gilded Age, power was not always measured in dollars or titles. It often lived in the drawing rooms, the ballrooms, and the unseen battles fought behind closed doors. Among the towering mansions and endless parties, one woman stood out not simply for her wealth, but for the way she turned society into her personal battlefield. Her name was Alva Vanderbilt, and while many dismissed her as just another socialite draped in diamonds, she was, in truth, one of the most formidable strategists of her era. Alva understood that influence was never freely given. It had to be taken, shaped, and sometimes forced into existence. She played society's game with the precision of a general, using architecture, spectacle, and even her own family as weapons in her quest for dominance. Imagine a woman who could outmaneuver the most powerful families of New York, challenge the queen of society herself, and even marry her daughter into European nobility, forever changing the way America's wealthy were viewed on the world stage. Then picture that same woman, years later, standing on platforms to demand women's right to vote, channeling her unyielding energy into reshaping politics as she had once reshaped society. Alva Vanderbilt was a force who refused to be confined by her time, and her story reveals not only the drama of the Gilded Age, but the timeless mechanics of power and ambition. Welcome to Words of Time, and in this video, we're diving into the fascinating world of Alva Vanderbilt. We'll uncover how she rose from obscurity to become a social powerhouse, how she fought and won battles against New York's old guard, and how her legacy continues to echo in the way we think about influence today. Of all the figures who moved through the intricate web of New York society in the late 19th century, few understood its codes and used them as effectively as Alva Vanderbilt. To many, she appeared at first as another wealthy woman married into one of the richest families of the Gilded Age, a socialite surrounded by fortune and privilege. Yet beneath the surface, Alva was more than a woman who lived on inherited wealth or ornamental grandeur. She was ambitious, strategic, and unusually aware of how society itself could be shaped and bent to her advantage. Her story is not simply that of a Vanderbilt wife, but of a power player who understood the mechanics of influence and worked tirelessly to create her own place in a world that was designed to exclude newcomers like her. The Vanderbilt family represented new wealth in an era when the boundary between the established elite and the recently rich was carefully guarded. The family's fortune, built by Cornelius Vanderbilt in shipping and railroads, was immense. By the time Alva married into the dynasty, the Vanderbilts were among the wealthiest families in the country, yet their money alone could not buy full acceptance in the most exclusive social circles. Old New York society, which traced its lineage through families such as the Astors and Schuyler, saw itself as custodians of tradition, class, and refinement. They looked down on those whose wealth came from recent enterprise rather than long-established land and lineage. The Vanderbilts, despite their power, were kept on the margins. Alva, however, was not content with this position. She saw in the Vanderbilt name both a barrier and a weapon. She understood that she could not erase the family's outsider status overnight, but she also recognized that its immense fortune gave her the tools to pry open the doors of society. Her ability to maneuver came from more than money. Alva Smith, before she became Mrs. William K. Vanderbilt, had her own sense of identity, pride, and social ambition. She was born into a Southern family that had fallen from wealth after the Civil War. This experience of watching her family's diminished status gave her a personal urgency. She was not only determined to recover what she had lost, but to elevate herself to a position even higher than the one she might have occupied before. Marrying into the Vanderbilts provided her with resources, but Alva herself supplied the drive, intelligence, and theatrical instinct that transformed resources into power. She began her social maneuvers carefully, but decisively. Early on, she realized that the path into society required both spectacle and subtlety. She could not simply demand acceptance, nor could she rely on quiet patience. What she needed was to create moments so dazzling, so unignorable, that the old guard would have no choice but to take notice. At the same time, she had to present herself as a woman of taste, refinement, and authority, qualities that even the most skeptical arbiters of society would have to acknowledge. Her first bold plays were designed with both of these goals in mind. One of the most famous of these maneuvers was the grand ball she organized in the late 1870s at her new Fifth Avenue mansion. At that time, Caroline Astor, the reigning queen of New York society, maintained a strict gatekeeping role. She controlled the so-called 400, the list of families considered socially acceptable. The Vanderbilts had been excluded from this list, and Alva understood that direct confrontation was risky. Instead, she staged her ball as an irresistible event. It was a spectacle of scale and extravagance unlike anything seen before, attended by European aristocrats and American figures of stature. Invitations to this ball became the most coveted in New York, and its success forced Caroline Astor's hand. The story goes that when Mrs. Astor's daughter wanted to attend, Alva coolly withheld an invitation until Mrs. Astor herself called formally on Alva, breaking her previous stance of exclusion. That single event, choreographed as both a social extravaganza and a calculated trap, marked Alva's first real victory in cracking open the doors of high society for the Vanderbilts. This was not an accident or a matter of simply spending more money than others. Alva understood that money alone would not impress the old guard. They had seen wealth before and dismissed it as vulgar if it was not accompanied by what they considered refinement. Alva's approach was different. She paid attention to details, worked with leading architects and designers, and ensured that her displays of wealth carried an air of elegance and cultural ambition. Her Fifth Avenue mansion, built by Richard Morris Hunt, was not simply a large house, but an architectural statement that reflected European grandeur and sophistication. By commissioning such a residence, she announced that the Vanderbilts were not merely wealthy, but capable of shaping the cultural landscape of the city. This architectural choice was itself a social maneuver. In an age when physical space reflected status, the creation of a home that rivaled or surpassed the mansions of older families was a direct statement of parity. Alva was using brick, stone, and design as tools of persuasion. Guests who entered her home could not dismiss her as a parvenu without also acknowledging the artistry and scale of the setting she had crafted. This was the stage on which she planned her first great performances as a hostess, and it worked. Her early efforts also revealed something about her character. She was not afraid of conflict, nor of using society's own rules against it. The episode with Mrs. Astor showed her talent for turning exclusivity into a weapon. By withholding an invitation, she demonstrated that she could play the same game as the old guard and even beat them at it. This was a bold move for a woman who had only recently entered this world, and it signaled her ambition in unmistakable terms. It also showed that she was thinking several steps ahead, calculating not just the immediate effects of her actions, but the long-term shifts they could produce. Once the Vanderbilts were included in the 400, the family's position in society was secured in a way that would endure beyond a single season. Another key to her strategy was her ability to link the Vanderbilt name with culture, philanthropy, and purpose. While she is remembered most vividly for her balls and mansions, Alva was equally skilled at creating associations that softened the image of raw wealth. She involved herself in projects that suggested civic responsibility and cultivated connections with artists and intellectuals. This was part of her effort to position herself not simply as a hostess, but as a leader, someone who could define what society itself should value. In this way, she was not only breaking into the elite, but also reshaping the very definition of it. Her early maneuvers, then, were not random flashes of extravagance, but carefully placed moves on a social chessboard. She built houses that doubled as statements, staged events that doubled as battles, and turned potential weaknesses into sources of power. She was a Southern woman with a fallen family who had married into a clan of outsiders. Yet by applying intelligence, theatricality, and determination, she began to transform both her own standing and that of the Vanderbilts. Her ambition was clear from the start, and her first bold plays left no doubt that she was more than a wealthy socialite. She was a strategist in silk gowns, wielding architecture, spectacle, and psychology as her weapons. Alva's instincts for spectacle and power reached their full expression with her architectural ambitions, most notably with the creation of Marble House in Newport. This mansion was not just another display of wealth. It was a deliberate statement and a direct challenge to the supremacy of old money families who had ruled Newport society for decades. At the time, Newport was the summer capital of American high society, the place where reputations were tested and secured. It was here, more than anywhere else, that old New York families reigned without challenge. Alva recognized that to establish herself and the Vanderbilts in a way that could not be denied, she needed to take this battlefield head-on. Marble House was her declaration of war. Built between the middle of the 1880s and the early 1890s, Marble House was unlike anything Newport had ever seen. Designed again by Richard Morris Hunt, the same architect who had created her Fifth Avenue mansion. It was modeled after the Petit Trianon at Versailles, the French royal retreat built for Marie Antoinette. Alva did not choose this model by accident. The reference to Versailles linked her home not just to Europe, but to monarchy itself, positioning her as a woman capable of setting herself beside queens and aristocrats. At the same time, the scale of the project was unprecedented. Marble House cost more than $7 million to build, with more than $500,000 spent on marble alone, figures that stunned contemporaries. But Alva was not simply indulging in excess. She was making a calculated point. While the Astors and other grandees of old money might have tradition, she could create something even grander, something so overwhelming in beauty and scale that it would redefine the standards of taste and power. Marble House was more than a residence. It was a stage, a fortress, and a weapon. Every column and gilded room was designed to impress and to intimidate. Visitors who entered its vast halls could not dismiss it as vulgar or temporary. It was a structure that belonged to the language of permanence and majesty. In this way, Alva translated the raw money of the Vanderbilts into a symbol that rivaled, and in some respects outshone, the heritage of old money families. It announced that the Vanderbilts were no longer outsiders begging for a place, but leaders defining what society itself should aspire to. Newport was the perfect theater for this drama because it was the social battleground where reputations were not only displayed, but also contested. The city was filled with grand cottages, summer homes of the richest families, each trying to outdo the other in architecture and entertainment. To succeed in Newport was to demonstrate mastery over the codes of high society at its most intense and competitive. For years, the Astors, the Lillards, and other long-established families had controlled this space, treating the newcomers as if they could never quite belong. Alva's decision to build Marble House, there was a direct provocation, a refusal to accept exclusion. She was taking the fight to the enemy's ground. Once the mansion was complete, Alva wasted no time in using it to consolidate her influence. She filled its rooms with lavish entertainments, but always with precision and purpose. Her balls and dinners were not mere parties, but calculated exercises in hierarchy. Invitations were carefully distributed, and attendance at Marble House became a mark of belonging to the new center of power. Alva turned the act of entering her home into a test of allegiance. Those who came were implicitly acknowledging her authority. In doing so, she shifted the balance in Newport, making herself not just a participant in society, but one of its commanding figures. This strategy was strengthened by her understanding that social dominance required alliances, particularly among women. The men of the Gilded Age were often busy with railroads, banks, and politics, but it was the women who governed the delicate machinery of society itself. Alva knew that she could not achieve her ambitions through isolation. She needed a network of women who shared her determination, or at least recognized her leadership. This was not a matter of idle friendship, but of strategic cultivation. She reached out to women who were themselves powerful hostesses, or who controlled access to circles she wanted to enter. She gave them reasons to align with her, whether through shared causes, shared stages at entertainments, or simple admiration for her audacity. One of her key tactics was to present herself as a woman of conviction, not merely of wealth. She involved herself in causes that allowed her to appear as more than a hostess, particularly women's rights, which she later championed with notable passion. This gave her relationships with women a deeper resonance, suggesting that her circle was not only about pleasure, but about influence and change. It also gave her an air of moral authority that softened the edges of her ambition. In the same way that Marble House transformed raw money into cultural power, her alliances transformed personal friendships into political capital. Newport gave her the opportunity to test and refine these strategies. The city's intense social calendar demanded constant maneuvering. Every dinner, ball, and garden party became an occasion for subtle contests of precedence. Alva thrived in this environment because she had both the confidence to confront rivals directly and the subtlety to build coalitions behind the scenes. She understood that while Marble House was the symbol, it was the network of women she cultivated that would give the symbol its lasting power. Through them, she spread her influence beyond her own entertainments into the broader rhythms of society. They echoed her decisions, reinforced her position, and ensured that her leadership was acknowledged even by those who resented it. Her cultivation of alliances also demonstrated her gift for balancing aggression with charm. She was known to be forceful, even domineering, but she could also be warm, persuasive, and generous. She knew when to press a point and when to flatter, when to display power and when to offer friendship. This adaptability made her a formidable player in Newport's endless games of precedence. Those who opposed her risked isolation, while those who aligned with her gained access to the glittering world she had created. In this way, she transformed Newport from a hostile ground into a place where her dominance was recognized and feared. Marble House, Newport, and her network of women together formed the foundation of Alva's greatest period of influence. They were all parts of a single strategy, to redefine society in her own image. Where others saw walls, she saw opportunities for conquest. Where others were content to be included, she insisted on leading. Through architecture, spectacle, and alliances, she reshaped the very stage on which society acted. The Astors and their peers could no longer pretend that the Vanderbilts were outsiders. Alva had made herself and her family not just a part of society, but one of its pillars. This momentum was not an accident. It was the result of calculation, persistence, and an unwavering belief in her own vision. The young woman who once watched her family's fortune vanish after the Civil War had become the orchestrator of one of the most significant shifts in American high society. And though she is often remembered for her extravagant mansions and elaborate parties, what truly defined her was the way she used those tools with precision. Marble House was not just a house, Newport not just a playground, and her friendships not just idle companionships. Each was a piece of a greater design. Alva's life in society after the triumph of Marble House showed that she did not view her victories as endpoints, but as positions from which to wage new campaigns. Just as she had transformed the Vanderbilts from outsiders into leaders, she continued to confront those who stood in her way with the same mix of aggression, intelligence, and flair for spectacle. She approached society as a battlefield, where the skirmishes were not fought with weapons, but with invitations, marriages, and reputations. What distinguished her was that she treated these contests with the seriousness of a general, combining strategy with bold execution. The art of war, as applied by Alva, was not about destruction but about control. Her aim was to command the stage of American society and to leave her rivals with no choice but to acknowledge her supremacy. One of the most telling of her social battles was her confrontation with Ward McAllister, the self-appointed arbiter of New York society. McAllister had long acted as the gatekeeper for Caroline Astor, curating the so-called 400, a list of those deemed worthy of inclusion in the city's highest social tier. For Alva, McAllister represented the entrenched old guard, a man who wielded exclusion as a weapon and who delighted in reminding new money families of their precarious status. She recognized that to maintain her dominance, she could not allow McAllister to dictate the terms of society. Her strategy was not to confront him in a direct quarrel, but to make him irrelevant, to build such overwhelming displays of influence that his lists and pronouncements would seem like relics of a bygone age. Her events at Marble House and later at other Vanderbilt residences became counterweights to the Astor-McAllister axis. She demonstrated that her invitations could rival, and in many cases surpass, those of her rivals in prestige. Those who attended her functions gained access to a new social order, one that was defined by her rather than by the dictates of McAllister. The effect was cumulative. Each ball, each dinner, each architectural masterpiece undermined his authority. In time, his power waned, not because Alva had defeated him in a single dramatic moment, but because she had shifted the entire landscape in which he operated. Society no longer revolved around the Astor-McAllister circle alone. It now revolved around the Vanderbilts, and most of all around Alva. In this way, she showed that battles in society were rarely won with one stroke. They were won by attrition, spectacle, and the patient accumulation of influence until one's rivals were left stranded, holding titles that no longer carried power. Her boldest and most controversial maneuver came in the matter of her daughter Consuelo. If society was a battlefield, marriage was one of its most decisive weapons. Marriages did not simply unite individuals, they united fortunes, reputations, and dynasties. Alva, always alert to the symbolic as well as the practical, saw in her daughter's marriage the chance to achieve something unprecedented. The old money families of New York had always used marriage to consolidate their status, but Alva aimed higher. She sought not merely to align with another American family, but to reach across the Atlantic, to link the Vanderbilts with the nobility of Europe. This was not just social ambition. It was social engineering of the highest order, an attempt to transform her family into something that could not be dismissed as parvenus because they would be bound by blood to the aristocracy itself. The target of this ambition was Charles Spencer Churchill, the 9th Duke of Marlborough, whose lineage stretched back through centuries of English nobility. The Duke was, however, in need of money, and Alva's vast fortune offered a solution. In orchestrating the marriage of Consuelo to the Duke in 1895, Alva achieved a coup that reverberated on both sides of the Atlantic. For old New York society, it was a humiliation. The families who had once scorned the Vanderbilts for their lack of pedigree now found that the Vanderbilts had secured a connection more illustrious than anything they themselves could boast. For European aristocrats, the marriage symbolized the growing reality that American money could sustain their great houses. For Alva, it was the ultimate victory, a demonstration that her vision extended beyond New York and Newport to the very heart of European aristocracy. The marriage, however, revealed not just her brilliance as a strategist, but also her ruthlessness. Consuelo herself was not eager for the union. She had her own desires and attachments, but Alva pushed forward with relentless determination, convinced that the sacrifice was necessary for the greater good of the family's destiny. On the morning of the wedding, it was said that Consuelo wept behind her veil, while society celebrated what it saw as the alliance of money and nobility. Alva later admitted that she had coerced her daughter, using maternal authority to secure the match. This episode shows the double-edged nature of her ambition. It was magnificent in scale, yet it exacted personal costs. To Alva, though, the outcome justified the means. The union of Consuelo and the Duke was a triumph of her social engineering, and it confirmed her place as one of the most formidable figures of the age. Yet even as she achieved these victories, the tides of society were beginning to shift. The world of the Gilded Age, with its rigid hierarchies and extravagant displays, was giving way to new currents of thought. The close of the 19th century brought with it greater attention to social reform, to women's rights, and to the growing middle class. The unbridled opulence of the elite was increasingly criticized as excessive and even immoral. Alva, perceptive as ever, saw that the strategies that had brought her to power would not sustain her in a changing landscape. She adapted, turning some of her energies toward causes that gave her a different kind of authority. Her embrace of the women's suffrage movement was both an expression of conviction and a continuation of her strategic instinct. By aligning herself with suffrage, she positioned herself as a leader not only in society, but in a broader political and cultural struggle. The same qualities that had served her in Newport, the ability to organize, to command attention, to forge alliances, were now redirected toward the fight for women's rights. She hosted meetings, gave speeches, and provided funding, lending the cause a social prestige that it had sometimes lacked. In doing so, she ensured that her name remained not only relevant, but influential in a new era. This shift also revealed something fundamental about her approach to power. For Alva, influence was never static. It had to be pursued, defended, and redefined in response to circumstances. Just as she had transformed the Vanderbilts from outsiders into leaders of society, she now transformed herself from a social strategist into a political activist. She refused to allow herself to be consigned to the role of a relic from the Gilded Age. Instead, she carried her force of personality into the new century, ensuring that she would remain a figure to be reckoned with even as the rules of society changed around her. Her later years showed the arc of a woman who had mastered the art of war in society. She began as a Southern girl with diminished means, rose to become the architect of the Vanderbilt's social supremacy, orchestrated triumphs that extended across the Atlantic, and then adapted her ambitions to a world in flux. Each stage was marked by battles won, often at great cost, but always with the imprint of her will and intelligence. What set her apart was not merely the wealth she commanded, but the way she understood power itself, as something that could be shaped, directed, and wielded through architecture, spectacle, alliances, and causes. When one looks back at her life, it is tempting to see her only in the glitter of Marble House, the grandeur of her balls, or the headlines of her daughter's royal marriage. But beneath these moments lies a deeper pattern. The story of a woman who treated society as a campaign, who fought her battles with unyielding energy, and who triumphed in ways that redefined what was possible for women of her time. Alva Vanderbilt was not simply a socialite. She was a general in silk, commanding not armies but the very fabric of society, leaving behind a legacy that was as ambitious and formidable as the marble halls she built. Alva's story did not end with her battles in Newport, her triumph over Ward McAllister, or even the marriage of her daughter to the Duke of Marlborough. Those victories had made her one of the most formidable women of her time, but they belonged to an era that was beginning to fade. By the dawn of the 20th century, the excesses of the Gilded Age were being challenged, not just by reformers and journalists, but by shifts in culture and politics that no single person could ignore. For a woman like Alva, who had always lived with her eyes fixed on the levers of influence, the question was not whether to change, but how to change in a way that preserved her relevance and power. Her pivot to suffrage, her embrace of philanthropy, and the quieter ways in which she reshaped her world all show that she was never simply a hostess or a schemer. She was, at her core, a strategist who always saw beyond the moment to the. Her move into the suffrage movement startled many of her contemporaries. To the society that had watched her dazzle in marble halls and orchestrate dynastic marriages, it seemed almost inconceivable that she would step into a cause associated with protest, politics, and the challenge of entrenched male authority. Yet the shift was in some ways a natural extension of her earlier life. Alva had always understood the power of women, and she had always insisted that she herself would not be confined to ornamental roles. The same qualities that had made her relentless in New York and Newport, her organizational skill, her confidence, her ability to command attention, were perfectly suited to a political struggle that needed leaders who could turn gatherings into statements and social status into credibility. She did not enter the suffrage movement as a minor supporter. She entered as a woman determined to lead. She used her wealth to finance campaigns, her homes to host meetings, and her social authority to give the movement legitimacy among classes that might otherwise have dismissed it. She gave speeches, some of them fiery in tone, calling out the inequities of a system that denied women the right to vote while depending on their labor, their loyalty, and their sacrifices. For a woman who had once used the placement of invitations and the design of mansions to shift social hierarchies, it was a profound reapplication of her skills. Where once she had staged a ball to corner Caroline Astor, she now staged rallies to corner public opinion. Her pivot showed that the tools of spectacle, influence, and control could be redirected from private gain to public reform. This turn also revealed the depth of her character in ways that her earlier triumphs had obscured. The suffrage movement was not universally admired. It was ridiculed in newspapers, opposed by powerful men, and often treated as the province of radicals. For Alva to align herself with it risked ridicule and alienation. But by this point in her life, she was no longer dependent on the approval of old money families or gatekeepers like McAllister. She had already secured her place in history. What she wanted now was impact, and she pursued it with the same relentlessness that had carried her from Southern obscurity to Vanderbilt magnificence. Her surprise embrace of suffrage was thus not only a political act, but a personal declaration that she was unwilling to grow irrelevant, unwilling to fade into the role of a relic remembered only for gowns and mansions. She wanted to shape the future, and suffrage gave her the arena to do so. Her work extended beyond politics into philanthropy, another realm where her influence was both strategic and significant. In the Gilded Age, philanthropy was often treated as a performance, a way for the wealthy to soften the sharp edges of their extravagance. But for Alva, it was an opportunity to design structures of improvement with the same care that she had once devoted to designing Marble House. She supported causes that dealt with health, education, and the advancement of women, seeing in them not only a chance to alleviate immediate needs, but also to reshape the foundations of society. She approached philanthropy as an architect approaches a blueprint, identifying where structures were weak, where foundations were missing, and where intervention could create lasting strength. In this work, her imagination was as evident as in her society battles. She did not simply write checks. She involved herself in planning, organizing, and ensuring that the institutions she supported reflected her vision. Just as her houses had been designed as statements of power, her philanthropic endeavors were designed as statements of purpose. She understood that charity could be shallow, but reform could be transformative. Her efforts were directed less toward temporary relief and more toward permanent improvement, a reflection of her belief that power should not only be seized but also used to build. These contributions, while less dazzling than a Vanderbilt ball or a European marriage alliance, were no less significant. They represented a woman taking the tools of privilege and repurposing them into engines of change. If Marble House had been her statement to society, her philanthropy was her statement to history. that she wanted to be remembered not only as a queen of spectacle, but as a force for progress. In this way, she connected the world she had conquered with the world she hoped to leave behind, bridging the grandeur of the Gilded Age with the reforms of the progressive era. Her legacy, when viewed in full, is one of disruption. At every stage of her life, she disrupted the patterns that were meant to confine her. She disrupted the barrier between old money and new by forcing the Vanderbilts into society's inner circle. She disrupted the supposed supremacy of Ward McAllister by rendering him irrelevant. She disrupted the conventions of marriage by arranging for her daughter to wed into European nobility, a match that made mockery of the Astors' snobbery. And in her later years, she disrupted the complacency of wealthy women by demanding that they take part in politics, in reform, and in the pursuit of equality. Each of these disruptions carried its costs: personal estrangements, whispered criticisms, the unhappiness of her daughter, but each also carried consequences that reached far beyond her own life. What makes her impact profound is that much of it was unseen in its time. The glitter of her mansions and the gossip of her entertainments captured public attention, but the deeper currents she set in motion only became clear later. By forcing the Vanderbilts into the center of society, she changed the definition of who could belong. By marrying Consuelo to the Duke of Marlborough, she showed that American fortunes could command respect in Europe, altering the balance between old and new worlds. By turning to suffrage, she lent the movement a legitimacy that helped it cross boundaries of class and respectability. And by pursuing philanthropy with seriousness, she laid groundwork for a vision of social responsibility that would grow in the 20th century. These were not small shifts. They were disruptions that redefined the Gilded Age itself. The Gilded Age is often remembered for its excess, its opulence, and its inequalities. But it was also an age of transition, a time when America was moving from a society defined by a narrow elite to one where wealth, ambition, and reform collided in new ways. Alva Vanderbilt embodied that transition. She was not an idealist in the traditional sense, nor was she a saint of reform. She was ambitious, proud, and often ruthless. Yet those qualities, when applied to the evolving world around her, produced outcomes that reached beyond her own desires. Her battles were fought for herself and her family, but their consequences rippled outward, altering the very structures she had sought to master. In the end, Alva's life can be seen as a series of acts in a single drama. In the first act, she used architecture and spectacle to break into society. In the second, she wielded marriage and alliances to expand her influence. In the third, she turned her energies to reform and philanthropy, reshaping her role as the tides of culture changed. Each act was marked by a refusal to accept the limits placed upon her. Each act was defined by her insistence that she would not be dictated to, but would dictate instead. Her gowns and jewels may have dazzled the eyes of her contemporaries, but it was her vision and determination that left the more lasting mark. To see her only as a society figure is to miss the larger truth. Alva Vanderbilt was a builder, not only of mansions but of possibilities. She built pathways into circles that had been closed, built alliances that reshaped hierarchies, built bridges between American wealth and European tradition, and built new foundations for women to step into public life. Her disruptions, quiet and profound, made her one of the most consequential figures of her age, even if her name is less often remembered than those of her rivals. What she left behind was not just stone and marble, but a reimagined society, one that bore the imprint of her will long after the last ball had ended. The later years of Alva's life reveal a woman who had grown beyond the rigid spectacles of the Gilded Age, but the strategies she employed and the ways she wielded influence still echo in striking ways today. It is easy to view her in the past, locked inside the gilded frame of her era, dressed in velvet and diamonds, presiding over a marble palace. Yet when one looks more closely, her maneuvers and her instincts reach forward into the modern world. She was, in many respects, a precursor to the dynamics of power, gender, and influence that remain central in contemporary society. What makes her story more than a historical curiosity is that it serves as a blueprint, both as an example of how power can be cultivated and as a cautionary tale about its costs. Her most obvious legacy is the way she demonstrated that visibility and control of narrative are as crucial as wealth. In her time, she understood that a family like the Vanderbilts could not simply buy their way into the upper echelons of society. They needed stories, spectacles, and symbols that could not be ignored. By orchestrating her famous Fifth Avenue Ball, by commissioning Marble House, and by marrying her daughter to a duke, she did not just spend money. She crafted events and images that shifted how people perceived her. Today, in a world where perception is often as important as reality, her methods feel startlingly familiar. Modern influencers, politicians, and entrepreneurs often follow the same logic. Visibility must be seized, not merely assumed, and the story one tells about oneself can be as important as the resources one possesses. Alva may have been clad in silk gowns rather than digital branding, but the principle she lived by resonates clearly in an age where control of image is central to success. She also anticipated the way power often resides in networks rather than individuals. Alva's cultivation of alliances among women in Newport and New York reflected a clear understanding that influence was rarely exercised alone. She built circles of support that reinforced her authority, and she positioned herself at their center, making herself indispensable. In modern terms, this strategy aligns with the way successful figures often surround themselves with collaborators, allies, and communities that extend their reach. Whether in business, politics, or activism, power is multiplied when it is shared and amplified through networks. Alva's life shows how a woman, denied access to formal avenues of authority, could build a parallel system of influence that was just as effective, if not more so. The social battlefield she dominated looks, in retrospect, like a forerunner of the collaborative strategies that define leadership today. Another modern parallel lies in her ability to adapt to shifting landscapes. When the Gilded Age opulence she embodied began to draw criticism, she did not cling stubbornly to the old order. She pivoted to suffrage and philanthropy, recognizing that new sources of legitimacy were emerging. This adaptability reflects a timeless lesson. Influence is never fixed, but must constantly be recalibrated to match cultural currents. In our era, where social and political landscapes shift rapidly, her instinct to change course without losing her authority feels particularly instructive. Leaders who fail to adapt are often left behind, while those who sense the tides and move with them remain relevant. Alva's transition from hostess to activist may have seemed dramatic, but it was simply the continuation of her lifelong practice of reading the moment and acting decisively. At the same time, her story forces us to reconsider how we measure women's impact in history. For much of the 20th century, she was remembered primarily as a flamboyant society figure, her achievements dismissed as little more than extravagance. But this view undervalues the depth of her strategies. Alva operated in a world that denied women official channels of authority. She could not sit in Congress, command armies, or run railroads in her own name. Yet she found ways to exert power in the spaces available to her. She used architecture, spectacle, and alliances to alter the balance of society itself. Her role in advancing women's suffrage shows that she understood the importance of pushing against the boundaries that constrained her sex. To dismiss her as merely a hostess is to overlook the ingenuity with which she wielded the tools available to her. Her life challenges the narrow ways in which history has often measured women's influence, reminding us that power is not always formal, visible, or easily recorded. Sometimes it operates through subtler channels, reshaping expectations and forcing change from within. This redefinition of influence matters because it helps us see the hidden architects of history. Alva's story makes clear that the forces shaping society are not always the ones enshrined in textbooks or official records. Her decision to host a ball forced the Astors to acknowledge the Vanderbilts. Her choice to build Marble House shifted the center of power in Newport. Her orchestration of Consuelo's marriage altered the perception of American wealth abroad. Her embrace of suffrage lent the movement the glamour and resources of one of the most formidable women of her age. None of these actions appear in lists of laws passed or wars won, yet they changed the society in which those laws and wars occurred. They remind us that influence often operates in invisible ways, setting the stage for more formal shifts. To look at Alva seriously is to recognize that women like her were not peripheral, but central to the making of their age. Her legacy also pushes us to confront the costs of ambition. The triumphs she achieved often came at personal expense, whether in the tears of her daughter forced into a loveless marriage, or in the criticisms she endured from those who saw her as arrogant and overbearing. The art of war in society was not gentle, and Alva did not always emerge unscathed. Yet these costs also underscore the seriousness of her pursuits. She was not playing at power, she was seizing it in a world that offered her few options. Her willingness to accept those costs highlights the depth of her determination, and it raises timeless questions about what individuals are willing to sacrifice for influence. In this sense, her life offers not only parallels but provocations. It challenges us to ask whether the pursuit of legacy is worth the strains it creates in private life, and whether ambition can ever be separated from the compromises it demands. When we look at the Gilded Age through Alva's lens, it becomes less a story of empty luxury and more a story of contest, transformation, and disruption. The excesses of that period are undeniable, but within them were individuals like Alva who were using the structures of wealth and society to challenge hierarchies, redefine roles, and lay groundwork for future change. Her story reminds us that even in times of great inequality, there are figures who push against the boundaries of what is possible. And it reminds us that history is not only about those who hold official titles, but also about those who maneuver behind the scenes, shaping perception, redefining belonging, and opening new spaces for those who come after. What makes Alva's story resonate most today is not the marble halls she built or the gowns she wore, but the clarity with which she saw the mechanics of power. She understood that society was not fixed but malleable, that influence could be constructed and seized, and that women, even within the limits of their time, could be central players in shaping their world. In a 21st century context where questions of visibility, networks, adaptability, and gendered power remain pressing, her strategies feel remarkably current. She offers both a model and a challenge. A model of how ambition and intelligence can redefine the possible, and a challenge to look more carefully at the hidden forces that continue to shape our own time. To revisit her life is to be reminded that beneath the surface of spectacle, there is often strategy, and behind the disguise of luxury, there can be profound influence. Alva Vanderbilt's story is not only about the Gilded Age, but about the timeless dynamics of ambition, adaptation, and disruption. She shows us that the figures who seem to be playing society's game are often the ones rewriting its rules. Her legacy inspires us to look more closely at the unseen forces that mold our world, to recognize the architects of influence who may not sit on thrones or in offices of state, but who nonetheless alter the course of history. Alva's enduring echo is the lesson that power is never simple, never static, and never confined to the obvious. It hides in ballrooms and suffrage halls, in marriages and mansions, in philanthropy and protest, waiting to be recognized. Her story urges us to search for it, to question what lies beneath appearances, and to understand that the shaping of society is often the work of those whose strategies unfold quietly but leave marks that last for generations.